Madam Secretary General, to begin with, how is the dual threat of debt and economic risk affecting climate vulnerable developing countries, if I may ask you?
Well, I think it's a devastating and toxic mix. If you look at what has been happening in the last 10 years in particular, you'll see that the number of exogenous shocks have gone up. The number of extraordinary climate disasters all over our world, but particularly in the developing countries in the global south, who are disproportionately affected by climate change. If you look at our 56 countries, you'll know that 33 of them are small states, 25 are small island developing states, and 14 are least developed states. And these countries are facing the existential threat of climate change. But look at what happened. This wasn't just climate change. We then had COVID. We've had the shock that has come as a result of the debacle between Russia and Ukraine. That has had a terrible impact on food insecurity. And all of that combined together has made many of our countries in deep debt distress. If you look at the combined GDP of the Commonwealth, we have about 13 trillion in 2021. We were hoping that that would rise and go to 19.5 trillion by 2027. But look at the stuttering that has happened for all of our economies. So this is truly worrying. If you look at the amount of contribution the G20 has made to the climate crisis, 80% of the contribution to greenhouse gases has come from the G20. If you look at the least developed countries, our developing countries, our small states, only about 5%. So in terms of responsibility, it is huge. But in terms of impact, that impact has really been felt so badly by our small states. And so we know, for example, that if we're to address climate change and achieve the net zero emissions by 2050, we're going to need $4 trillion by 2030. Right now, notwithstanding that in 2009, the global community said they were going to deliver $100 billion a year, right now we have only reached 630 billion. So we're way off target. And the consequences for our small states, for our developing states, have been really dire. It takes SIDS about 2 years to develop a climate proposal, followed by another year for the legal and implementation arrangements before governments receive any funds and begin the process. And for LDCs, it can take 4 to 5 years for GCF to approve a project, not counting the time it takes to develop the initial proposals. Now, this ability to get the money is critical if we're going to do the adaptation and mitigation. So I think we are in a dire position, and we need to change, and we need to change fast. The debt distress is real.
Wonderful. I'm not cutting you short, but Madam Secretary General, given that 60% of climate vulnerable countries are currently in debt distress, like you said, which impedes, as you know, their investment in climate resilience, how can the international community address this issue? And specifically, what is the Commonwealth doing to support its member countries to resolve this mega challenge, as you stipulated or made mention of it?
Well, what we know is GDP is no longer a reliable criterion to determine how we get overseas development aid or assistance. because a number of the, for example, the small states who are assessed as being high are inherently vulnerable because of their size, because of their location, and because of climate change. When a hurricane or a cyclone comes and hits you, it doesn't ask about your fiscal rectitude. It doesn't ask you whether you're high income, low income, or middle income. And before it hits you, you may be any of those things. After it hits you, you may be a no income country. So to continue to simply look at GDP does not equate with the reality of where we are today. And therefore, we have to look at the innate vulnerability of some of our countries. We've got to look at the exogenous shocks to which we have been subject. In the old days, it was almost as if people said each of us were the arbiters of our own good fortune. If we were fiscally prudent, if we took the steps that we should take, if we managed our budgets and balanced them, then we should be able to do all that which is necessary to keep our citizens in our member states happy, healthy, and hale. We know that's not true, because governments aren't responsible for the hurricanes. Governments aren't responsible for the drought. Governments aren't responsible for the cyclones. They're not responsible for the intra-state conflict in other areas. They're not responsible for the food insecurity, yet they have to deal with it. So what we in the Commonwealth have done is we recognize that reality, and we've created a universal vulnerability index, which looks at our vulnerability, which looks at the resilience, and is able to more accurately balance what the reality, the lived reality of what our people are facing. And what we're also saying is we have to fundamentally review and reform the international financial institutions who were created at a time when these challenges were not recognized. And they were probably fit for purpose. The Bretton Woods arrangement was fit for purpose for 1945. We're now 2023. And we, those of us who are responsible for the international structure today, have to revise and look and see whether the current system is truly fit for purpose. And as you say, with the debt distress that we now have being over 60%, with it being higher than ever before, and almost double the figure it was just in 2015. So we're only thinking about 8 years ago, we had half the amount of debt. And this has not been as a result of any lack of care or prudence or fiscal rectitude. It has been as a result of the exogenous shocks which are out with. And if you look at the climatic position, if the countries who are aberrantly affected by the climate were responsible for the creation, you would say maybe there's a little justice, but they're not. And yet they are feeling the brunt of it. And many of our countries really fear, justifiably, that the threat they face is truly existential. And if you look at what's just happened to Pakistan, third of Pakistan underwater, what's happened to Malawi, what's happened to Mozambique, what's happened to Vanuatu, 2 cyclones within a matter of days. In the old days, you would have 1 Category 5 hurricane once in a lifetime, 72 years. Now it looks as if we're having them almost every other day. A cyclone, 7 or 8 years. Now you could have 2 cyclones within 1 week. This is a dramatic change, and we have to really address the reality that our member states are finding themselves in. The debt in the old days, they didn't know whether there was a correlation between these terrible events and debt. Now we know. And so we really have to do better. And It really worries me because the global debt levels are expected to remain elevated at over 94% of
Mm,
GDP from 2022 to 2027, above the pre-pandemic level, which was 83.6%. And the public debt as share of GDP spiked across the Commonwealth to 72% in 2021 from 59% in 2019. Well, how are countries supposed to deal with that? And the other thing that we feel is grossly unfair is the percentage that our poorer countries are spending in paying debt interest rates, which are disproportionately higher than their richer cousins who were contributing much more to the situation we now find ourselves in. So this is why you'll hear so many people talking about climate justice. You know, when you've surpassed the 60% threshold, now standing at 64.7%, this is unconscionable. And
mm,
we really, really have to do better.
Madam Secretary General, you mentioned the Bretton Woods institutions just a little while ago, but why do you think there's a need to reform multilateral lending practices to support vulnerable countries more adequately and effectively in tackling climate change? And in this, I would want to ask what the Commonwealth is doing about this.
Yeah, well, we are creating, as I mentioned too, a universal vulnerability index because we believe that if you apply this index as opposed to GDP, you will get a more realistic estimate as to how these countries who are adversely affected by these multiplicity of exogenous shocks should fairly be supported. And we also believe that if you were to review and reform the international institutions, then they would be better able to address the devastating impacts that many of our countries are struggling with. The small states don't have the capacity, they don't have the money to do this on their own, but they are fighting and they are doing everything within their ability to change the paradigm in which they currently sit. And we have to fight with them and for them and to raise the fundamental unfairness that they are currently facing. Because I think there's no question about how climate vulnerability is driving up the cost of capital and undermining debt sustainability. So we simply cannot sit back and watch vulnerable countries drown in both climate change and debt. Vulnerable nations which have contributed the least to climate change are paying twice for the damage endured during disasters and through the higher costs of capital they have to borrow to rebuild. And this is just not acceptable, it's unjust, and it's morally unconscionable. And if you look at the Commonwealth, we have had an impressive track record of bold and consistent leadership and practical support on these issues. I'll just give you some examples. You know, we were instrumental, our role was instrumental in the heavily indebted Poor Countries Initiative, helped many countries to achieve debt sustainability. Then the Commonwealth Charter paved the way for the SDGs. And then we got the call for leaders in 2022 CHOGM for more action on loss and damage, which was the catalyst, I believe, for the new fund agreed at COP27 months later. We've been trying for 27 years to get loss and damage on the agenda. And I think it's interesting and important to note it was only when the 56 countries came together in Rwanda, in Kigali, and said, we need to address this. That was a big push at Sharm el-Sheikh to get us over the line. But there's much for us to do because although we've got the fund, We still don't know the modalities, we don't have the money, and now the push has to come in. So our recent work through the Climate Finance Access Hub, with a tiny amount of money, 1.5 million was the initial pounds, was the initial investment. We've had a bit more since then. We've already delivered 250 million US dollars into the hands of our small states. But we need more. That's not enough. We've got about 800 million in the pipeline to help, and 72% of that is adaptation. However, we need to get behind this initiative and make sure that all our members who need a climate finance advisor gets one. We have to build capacity in countries. We've got to train our advisors so they really understand how they can assist to make the difference that our member states needs to make. So there's masses that we're doing. We've created the Common Sensing Initiative. We've got a Climate Finance Access Portal. We're doing, as I said, the Blue Charter, the Living Lands. All of that is making a difference, but it's not enough. And it's going to take all of us.
Right. Madam Secretary General, before you leave, tell me the rationale behind the decision of the Commonwealth to propose a change in the criterion for determining a country's eligibility for international development finance. And why do you think it's necessary for the international community to move away from relying solely on GDP, like you mentioned, as an indicator, and instead adopt a more nuanced approach that considers a country's vulnerability to external shocks, such as climate-related disasters?
I think this change has come about as a result of the appreciation for the situation that our member states now find themselves in. As I said earlier, in the past, the idea was we ourselves were responsible. It was all within our own gift. We determined. We were the final arbiters. That's not the reality. We have seen, I just take, for example, my own country of birth. Dominica was seen as fiscally prudent, careful, doing well, turning from low income to middle income, and all was as it should be. Along came Tropical Storm Erica in 2015. It destroyed 95% of Dominica's GDP. It was thought that it would not have another such incident, maybe for 72 years, it's once in a lifetime. 2 years later, in 2027, Dominica was hit by Hurricane Maria. It destroyed 226% of Dominica's economy. So we went from a middle-income country to a no-income country within 6 hours. Then we were subject to COVID. Borders were closed. There was no money and our opportunity to build. After that has come the living crisis as a result of food prices. So all of these exogenous shocks are out with the control. And if you're only going to use GDP as the criterion through which countries, particularly the small, particularly the vulnerable, but also some of the big, and I mentioned Pakistan, if your GDP is the only criterion, then we are doomed to fail our member countries who are inherently vulnerable through no fault of their own. It's their geographical location. And, you know, we used to say before that these climatic incidents were acts of God. We now know that they're created as a result of acts of man. Our omissions and commissions have got our world into the situation we are now. All of us have one planet. There is nowhere else for us to go. We rely on the oceans for our air, for our food, for our livelihoods, for the air we breathe. If we are going to pollute our oceans, if we're going to devastate our land, then we as humanity are not going to survive. And if we don't understand that as a result of our acts and omissions, the world has changed, and we need to change, and we need to respond in order to be the difference we need to make, then we will fail, not just ourselves, but we will fail our children, our grandchildren, and we will fail our world. And I think it's those of us today who are in the driving seat who will be making the decisions. And so we are supporting the Bridgetown Initiative. We are supporting the call for a radical reform of the IFIs. We're calling for a fairer, more just, more equitable assessment, which really takes into account the empirical data we now have about the reality that we faced. And it's just pointless to say to people, nothing's going to change. The system, which is totally broken, isn't broken, and we will limp on as we now are. It's not working. And this world does have the capacity, when it chooses, to move swiftly and radically if it cares enough. We saw that in COVID. We've seen it on a number of different occasions. We need to do the same now. We need to say it's time for change.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary General, for spending some time with us. We appreciate your time.
No, thank you very much.